Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Southern Fire Exchange webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. Today, I'm excited to feature a presentation on our program with Emily Link, who is a regional fire ecology specialist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast. Emily will be sharing a presentation on her work to use next generation terrestrial laser scanning to advance fuels and fire management monitoring on public lands across the Southeast. Our presenter today is Emily Link, and Emily is the regional fire ecologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Southeastern region. She's worked with terrestrial laser scanning, also known as TLS, and you'll see that in the presentation today, since 2020, and has coordinated the LiDAR program within the region since 2021. Emily's also involved in the development of TLS training individuals across the country and within different agencies on how to use the equipment and the different techniques. Emily is also a technician and a coordinator for the region's airborne laser scanning, ALS, operating a sensor from a fixed wing plane, collecting data for refuges with the national forests across the Southeast. So with all that, welcome, Emily. Welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here today.
Thanks, David. As he said, today I will be discussing how we use LiDAR in fish and wildlife in the Southeast to help inform our land management. If you're unfamiliar with LiDAR, it stands for Light Detection and Ranging. Many of you may be familiar with airborne LiDAR scanning, which is often used to map the characteristics of the surface of the Earth. Our program uses terrestrial laser scanning, which I will be referring to as TLS. So rather than looking down at the forest from a drone or an airplane, we place a laser in the understory, which sends out millions of light points as it's spinning around 360 degrees. And as each of those light points hits an object, it returns the laser. And based upon the time it takes to hit that object and return, the laser knows that there's something at that specific point. So we are able to build very detailed 3D models called point clouds from those millions of data points. And this informs land management because it captures the understory and the midstory, which airborne cannot. Next. Here's a very zoomed out example of one of the point clouds from St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge in North Florida. I often get the question, what is the range? And as you can see from the screenshot of a point cloud, it has the potential to reach out a very far distance. The sensor collects information as far as the point of light can reach. The red square at the bottom of the image is indicating a target we use to assist with scan orientation, and that placard is about 12 meters from plot center. According to the specs of the sensor, its furthest range is 60 meters. However, this obviously depends on the surrounding environment that the light points are reacting to. In denser vegetation, such as this Pocosin from North Carolina, the light is not able to reach as far out. And during the point cloud analysis our process uses, the scan is cropped to 15 meters, equating to about a 10th acre plot. And this is to mitigate possible data loss or distortion, and just to ensure that the best point density and data is being analyzed. So moving on to our TLS program in the Southeast, within the region, there was a need to adopt a rapid means of monitoring that required minimal training and could quantify wildland fuel and habitat change over time. We first began establishing TLS plots in 2021. In 2021, we started with 2 refuges, and we are now at 19. For the map, as you can see from the legend, the dots with 1 year of scans are yellow, and refuges with at least 2 are orange, but a few refuges have 3 or 4 years of scans. We utilized teams of interns to establish the plots at the refuges. The first year baseline plots are established along with the scan, and during that process, field vegetation data is collected. Next. As I just mentioned, the first time we collect field measurements at that plot. These take about 45 minutes to an hour to complete, depending on the density of that vegetation. The scan is taken at the middle of the plot, and the meter tape is stretched from north to south and west to east. Along the transects, the Technicians complete a point intercept, presence absence, and coarse-woody debris surveys, as well as measure the heights of the field bed and depth of the litter at specific distances from center. After the transects are sampled, technicians document the tree species within 10 meters of center and use a 10-factor prism to estimate the basal area. And then a rescan is taken after treatment or the next year, and these rescan plots take about 10 minutes to complete and can be done by one person. Once the scans are taken in the field, they are uploaded to Intellimon. The screenshot of that site is seen here. And Intellimon is an interactive data viewer developed by USGS Aeros. The scans are processed through their geo engine with scripts refined by our data analyst. And the point clouds and the results are also stored in their database, and then those results are delivered through this Intellimon. Any user can go to this site and select what area and years they want to download data from and those selected plots. There are plots from all over the country, even collected in Alaska. And when I took this screenshot, the database had over 4,000 scans available. This system is utilized by many different agencies, as you can see from the legend. Now, you might notice the legend says open data, and this is because there are some agencies and organizations that have their own viewing page due to the area being sensitive. Some of the stakeholders involved beyond Fish and Wildlife are from Department of Defense, Forest Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and it's being used in research at national parks as well. These are just some of the useful metrics produced by TLS. Over 200 are outputted from scans. Intellimon just outputs the raw metrics. For the metrics on the right column, under the predicted, such as a cover percent, it really takes the data analyst to build models using that tier 2 data and machine learning to make the data useful to land managers and practitioners. So what do I mean by machine learning? I'm not going to go into too much detail with this, but I will try to explain the basics because I'm sure that some of you have questions about how these metrics are produced. There are two types of machine learning that are incorporated into Intellimon and TLS data process. These are unsupervised and supervised. The unsupervised learning involves clustering algorithms. This is able to cluster and classify ground and tree points and filter out noise. This is also used to identify and measure tree diameters. So an algorithm, it identifies horizontal C shapes, so the letter C, on their side, kind of that horseshoe shape. If it identifies a bunch of those C shapes stacked on top of each other, it is able to predict where trees are and their width. Next. Supervised learning, on the other hand, requires training data, which is where the field measurements are needed. One use of supervised learning would be the classification of clusters. So if there were buildings versus trees in a scan, those points are clustered differently. So the AI can be trained to identify the building cluster versus the tree cluster. But that supervised learning requires data scientist intervention and field information about the buildings and the trees to classify which are buildings and which are trees. There are also different logistic regression models that can be built to predict different variables. I have a couple examples there on the screen, and these compare the observed value that the field collects with the algorithm's predicted value. And I would just like to note that the field variables will likely have error in them. So if the field data being fed in is not quality, then the quality results will not be produced. Moving on from the empirical data results to this visual component. So this data is very beneficial for assessing whether objectives of treatments were met or not. It is policy within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that management plans have objectives. We utilize prescribed burning and mechanical and chemical treatments to meet those hazardous fuels and habitat objectives. As you can see from the top of the screen, between June of 2021 and October 2022, a mechanical treatment was completed for this plot, and the shrub cover decreased by over 50%. So these scans provide data documenting the changes over time from land management, and it empowers the land manager to make decisions based upon results. Next. This data is also valuable for documenting response and recovery as well. So oftentimes the public gets upset when they see timber harvest and prescribed fire and chemical application because habitat restoration, it can look destructive at first, but that treatment leads to a healthier and more resilient ecosystem. So these scans are just a way to easily and quickly communicate that message of long-term restoration with that image. The images on the site may not always be helpful for land managers' decision making, but they are really valuable for telling the story of management to individuals who are less informed. This site can be used as a tool for legislators to virtually travel from stand to stand across the country and see various types of habitat and management histories. And it can be used to justify why treatments are necessary by comparing managed and unmanaged conditions across landscapes. Now, within our program, we aren't using this for research grade plots, although there are many groups that are doing so, such as the Forest Service Southern Research Fire Lab. We are using it as a long-term monitoring tool to assess change over time on our refuge lands. This is a screenshot of a data viewing dashboard developed by our regional fire planner, Lita Douglas. It's a GIS platform for land managers to quickly assess the hazardous fuels and habitat structure within management plots. So if you look at this map, the darker the color, the higher the field bed. And on that right panel, there are also detailed metrics per unit that if someone was interested in viewing the specifics. And then at that bottom, there is that panel to move through time and see the changes from scan to scan. Next. Once all this data was collected, the question became which of the outputted metrics are most useful for wildland fuel and fire management, and which should be displayed on dashboards like the one I was just showing. We really needed to identify how that data can benefit land managers at refuges and what information can it provide to help the decision-making process. We have objectives in our fire management plans and prescribed fire plans, but which TLS metrics actually respond to management and how does prescribed fire influence these field metrics over time? As I said, there are over 200 metrics outputted from Intellimon, but for fields management, that is a bit excessive. So the National Fire Monitoring Coordinator wanted to identify 3 or 4 metrics that influence fire behavior within the system. He made an additional variable of time since burned and then modeled that relationship between time and each metric using a correlation matrix. So if you're looking at this chart, each row is a different refuge, and then that top row is the 4 refuges averaged. And if the cell has color, there is significant correlation. The darker the color, the stronger the correlation. Orange is positive correlation, so that means the metric increases with the increase of time since burned. The blue is negative correlation, so as time since burned increases, that metric decreases. If that's still a little confusing, a great example is shrubs and grasses. The longer an area goes without fire, the more shrubs have an opportunity to grow and there's less grass. So that would be your positive correlation in your negative. The grass is your negative, shrub is your positive. And this chart just helps us identify what metrics we are able to set objectives for. It helps show where the change from fire is most significantly measurable. At St. Mark's, they're trying to increase grass cover and decrease shrubs. So TLS is a tool that easily quantifies how much that cover increases or decreases since time burned. So these linear models provide some empirical data regarding how frequently burns need to occur to maintain conditions or meet objectives. The slope for field bed, for example, revealed that the field bed increases an average 7 centimeters per 12 months. And of course, that's habitat type dependent. And now this, you all understand that after a burn occurs, typically the field bed is reduced. When you don't burn, vegetation likely has a greater opportunity to grow, but this tool just quickly measures that height and it links it with time. And then full disclosure, these results are a bit outdated. We are currently working on that GIS dashboard from the earlier slide to update them. And then the next steps will also be habitat delineation. And then these are obviously different models, and they highlight how different field bed conditions change over time, spatially at different refuges in the Southeast. The red areas indicate significant rates of growth and thresholds of the system. They quantify the rate of change, the rate of growth in the different field types, which could impact management. It helps answer the question, when do we need a treat before the growth happens and it becomes unmanageable? What is the threshold for maybe when prescribed burning is not enough and mechanical or chemical treatment may be necessary? When is it no longer just in that maintenance phase? So this helps really quantify that. And looking at St. Mark's in that lower right corner, that could be, that looks to be before it reaches 60 centimeters. Um, Now, what is helpful for land managers during planning is the spatial aspect. So these are maps at St. Mark's showing that field bed height, similar to the dashboard I showed earlier, but these are obviously static. Maps and dashboards allow for the identification of where field loading is the greatest. So the map on that right has that 60 centimeter threshold designated. And then again, that depends on objectives for that particular unit and habitat type. But these can just be tools for planning and prioritization based upon the tools, based upon the fuels in that unit. Moving on from St. Mark's, Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge in Georgia did a really great job of monitoring post burn. So we were able to compare the values from 2021 with 2022. For this data, we scanned summer of 2021. The refuge burned spring of 2022, and then the scans were taken again summer 2022. For the model on the left, the metrics with a statistical significant change have an asterisk. But just because there wasn't a statistical difference, that doesn't mean there wasn't an important change. Looking at depth, for instance, in the top middle, if the objective was to reduce depth by a centimeter, then that objective was met, even if it wasn't statistically significant. But these scans just really quickly and easily quantify the change in fields after the burn, and it can be used to assess effectiveness. So if their objective was to reduce field bed significantly, they did that. If it was to reduce 100-hour fields, they did that. But if it was also to statistically significantly reduce the woody cover, perhaps they need a different method. And then the model on the right is displaying the average field bed over all the pre and all the post-treatment plots. So this chart can tell you two things. The first is by looking at the distribution of field bed across the refuge. So pre-refuge or pre-treatment, the height of the vegetation is pretty variable among the plots. But post-treatment, that peak signifies that there is a greater occurrence of that similar value. And so that field bed is more uniform across the landscape post-burn. If you're looking at the dotted lines, those are the average heights. So it is clear that the field bed was reduced, and we are able to quantify that for the manager, so it's able to capture whether the burn objective was met or not. Or the values can be shown to a congressman or the general public to show that we are reducing wildfire risk. Within the Fish and Wildlife Service, we manage our land to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants for their habitat. Prescribed burning is often done to meet habitat objectives of critical species. Critical species also impact and influence how or why land is managed. The presence of a certain species may restrict ignition patterns or seasonality of when burning can occur or what equipment might be used. And one of those species in the Southeast is the Mississippi sandhill crane. To begin this case study, we identified what the habitat management plan referenced for evaluating suitable habitat for the cranes. So these variables included ground cover type and canopy height, which can be modeled using the TLS metrics. So the Mississippi crane was a really great candidate for this effort because the crane locations are tracked using radio telemetry equipment. The data analysts then use just the TLS data to model and spatially depict each of the crane habitat variables identified in the management plan. So these include a grass cover, forb cover, shrub cover, and canopy cover. Next. The data analysts then used the radio telemetry data to score each of those TLS metrics based upon the frequency of cranes visiting those areas. So the areas the cranes visited the most got a score of 10, and the areas the cranes visited the least got a score of 0 for each of those 4 metrics. So if you look at the box in the top left there, the grass cover the cranes visited the most was actually 60 to 70% grass cover. And then this is a map spatially depicting each of those scores for the different metrics. So again, these scores are made using the crane tracking information and what value the cranes visited the most. Then the data analyst added up the scores for each of the 4 TLS metrics to give an overall habitat suitability score out of 40. And the average score across the refuge was about a 34 out of 40. The data analyst then overlaid the crane location data with the TLS data, and the areas that the cranes visited, they got a score of 38 out of 40. Next. And then the final step was to ensure that there was a statistical significance regarding the areas the cranes were utilizing and those that they were not. For that assessment, the data analyst produced random crane locations across the refuge equal to the number of actual tracking points, which were a few thousand points, which is why they're covered the entire refuge. And the mean for those locations was 34. So this is the same as the refuge mean since those thousands of points covered the refuge. Next. Prescribed fire is a treatment utilized to manage the habitat for the cranes. So these are linear models for the TLS metric cover types and the field bed height modeled with the time since burned variable. So this data can help managers and practitioners better understand the vegetation response from fire that correlate or to correspond with the crane's habitat. So these models can be used to evaluate the long-term effectiveness of the treatments and how frequently burning is required to ensure the conditions stay within the suitable parameters. So it's just really to help justify that frequency. Thanks. So this data can be used to identify the most suitable units of the refuge and then replicate the treatment history from those suitable units on less suitable areas. They can be used to provide evidence for why different restoration and treatments are necessary. Should less informed individuals question the techniques. It can also be used for identifying areas for restoration. And then priority for the crane biologist is finding new nests. However, resources are very limited for those nest surveys. So the spatial data could be used to strategically survey for nests or select new areas that were actually not previously known as to be suitable. Next. Beyond these in-house data applications for wildlife refuges, our region is also a partner within the Eastern Innovation Landscape Network. The EILN was formed as a result of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy update, during which the Wildland Fire Leadership Council noted fire behavior modeling and other tools were not being as effectively used and communicated to decision makers and practitioners. The EILN is an initiative with the goal of increasing co-production through a formalized interagency framework in which fire practitioners from the Forest Service, Department of Defense, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the eastern U.S. engage with fire scientists through the innovation process. LiDAR is a part of this because it provides that 3D fuels component for the next generation fire behavior models. Next. So LiDAR can serve as an input into Fast Fuels. Fast Fuels is a platform that generates detailed 3D fuels information modeled from FIA data, but the data inputted into the platform may be slightly out of date or assumptions are made. So Fast Fuels can be improved with LiDAR data, both airborne and terrestrial. This is really important for fire modeling because previous fire models, such as the Rothermel fire models, assumed a uniform fuel bed and a limited interaction between canopy and surface fire and fuels. So having this 3D component of the fuel bed to link into the fire models allows modern fire scientists to more accurately simulate a fire behavior in a landscape. Next. Next. There we go. One of the fire modeling platforms that FastFields feeds data into is QUIC-Fire. So this is a video of a QUIC-Fire simulation. QUIC-Fire is a tool developed by Los Alamos National Laboratory that models the complex and dynamic behavior of wildland fire. Users are able to explore how different ignition, weather, and fuel scenarios may interact during prescribed burns to produce different fire behavior and ecological outcomes. Next. Next. There we go. Okay. This platform can serve as a decision support tool for planning prescribed burns. It can run on units up to around 4,000 acres, and it runs at near or faster time or faster than real time, depending on size and complexity of model runs. And consumption estimates can be directly compared to burn objectives. Next. So some things to keep in mind. While TLS has been used for years in research, we are still exploring the applications for land managers. There is great potential for empowering land managers to make decisions based upon the best data available, but it is a process of collecting data in co-production to identify what is most useful for them and how they can apply it. One of the really great benefits of TLS is the scans are saved forever. So the scan captures the position of a leaf during that time the scan was taken, and the analysis are continually being refined and improved. So with each update, all the past scans that are in the database are reprocessed with that most updated code. So right now we can't get species identification, but if in 5 years we are able to identify invasive species, then all the past scans will be reprocessed and the trends of that species can be tracked. So gone are the days of deciphering old, poorly written data sheets or wishing that technicians in the past had collected different variables at those plots. And then finally, a major contributing factor for the produced products is the training data inputted. So the data analysis cannot model a metric that they don't have inputted data to train the machine learning. So if you want a TLS data to model a certain deliverable, such as linking it to the standardized fire behavior models, then that information has to be collected at the same time as the scan. So now I have time to give a brief overview of our airborne LiDAR program. In 2023, our regional fire program invested in an airborne LiDAR sensor to be operated out of a fixed wing plane. Next. The plane and pilot are with the U.S. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Migratory Bird Program. The belly of the plane has a pod with doors that open, and there's a plate specifically made to hold that sensor. The data analysts are with the New Mexico Consortium, just as they are with the TLS. And they actually report that the data quality ranges from 0 to 1 quality, and sometimes it's even a little too high quality and it causes more noise. And along with the LiDAR sensor, there are 2 cameras that also take high quality imagery. We use the TopoFlight for calculating flight parameters and generating flight lines. We use a 45% overlap, so we don't get photogrammetry level quality imagery data, but our priority is the LiDAR data, so 45% is accurate. And then we also use a 200-meter buffer around the location to ensure we capture the boundary well. We encountered a lot of challenges when trying to place ground control targets. We tried finding USGS survey markers, but they were a little difficult to locate, and they were not always in the best spots for a large target. Refuges and forests are often in very forested and rural areas, so the trees interfered with the receiver to document the coordinates, and so the receiver could not connect with satellites very accurately. Vegetation impacts how flat the target was. Cloudy days were also terrible for connecting with the satellites. Targets were stolen. And so we had some general issues getting the coordinates off the receiver and really placing those targets. So we ended up just investing in software that corrects the data, and we are now waiting until after the data is processed. And then from that processed data, we are able to identify good structures that we can see in those images to use as controls. Next. This is just a list of some of the tasks that the technician completes. I generate the flight lines, operate the sensor, monitor the screens to ensure the scanner and camera are collecting data, and I record different information about the lines. Since the fall of 2023, we have collected over 925,000 acres. These include national fish and wildlife refuges, national forest in Louisiana, and a military base at Cape Canaveral. And we collect an average of 6,000 acres per hour. There are a lot of scheduling limitations. As I said, the pilot's primary duty is with the migratory bird program. So the LiDAR flights just kind of have to fit into the very limited schedule. Next. As I mentioned, we collaborate with the New Mexico Consortium for their data analysts, and then this is just a list of products they can deliver for our refuges or for the national forests. So the following slides were prepared by Grant Sticker. He's the Director of Cultural Resources with New Mexico Consortium. I will likely not be able to answer any of your questions about them, but I just thought they'd be really good examples to show of some applications for the LiDAR, aerial LiDAR. So it can identify different archaeological features and terrain. Next. These are just some image examples of what the airborne can produce. Characterization of fuel, surface. And then this is an example of some of the lines collected, and this was some of the LS data from Kisatchie National Forest. Next. These were some historic pit structures identified on the forest that we could see from the scanning. And then, so those pit structures could be potential tar kilns or World War II training infrastructure. And if they are tar kilns, I believe they may be the furthest west identified. Next. And then that image is just during the ground truthing of the pits. And then another application is identifying historic logging lines. Again, ground truthing. And then these are just more images of craters identified. And the LiDAR data is going to be really valuable for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for planning like larger hazardous fuels reduction, different timber harvests, mapping forest types, mapping microtopography, especially in the wetlands and the swamplands, and identifying cultural resources to protect. Has seen in these images, it's really great with cultural resource identification. And then for the Southeast, it's for documenting sea level rise, different erosion, and especially impacts from extreme weather events such as hurricanes. I think that's the end of my slides. So thank you all for your time and attention today, and looks like I have plenty of time to take any questions. If anyone wants more information, I will answer to the best of my ability.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Emily, for your presentation. Once again, if you joined us during Emily's presentation, my name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. And our speaker today is Emily Link with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So at this point in our program, as Emily said, we have time remaining for you to ask questions. We ask that you please type your questions and comments into the Q&A tool in Zoom, and then we will use that to get through them in the time that we have available today. Like we said earlier, we've enabled a feature in Zoom that allows you to upvote for other questions submitted by participants. So we encourage you to please use this feature to help us to prioritize the questions so that we can get to the ones that the most folks are interested in. So time remaining, please type your questions in. This is pretty cutting edge stuff, and a lot of it's fairly technical. Thanks for sharing it with us, Emily. I'm curious to kind of just to wrap my head around it a little bit. How long does it take to scan a plot? Does it depend on the vegetation, or is that independent and it's just based on the equipment?
The scan itself is equipment dependent. we are using the BLK 360 from Leica, and they have released 2 generations of that laser. So the first version is the Gen 1, and that laser takes 3 to 5 minutes to complete a scan. The Gen 2 takes 45 seconds to a minute to complete the scan. And the Gen 2, there's also an app that you can connect to on like your cell phone or your iPad, and you can watch the scan as it's happening to make sure that it was fully successful, and you can view the point cloud right there. And then it's stored on your device. But yes, that's depending on the laser itself, and then collecting that field data, that is vegetation dependent. So often it averages 45 minutes to an hour. If it is an extremely dense plot and it takes a lot of time to set up those transects as you're trying to climb through everything and not tramp down the vegetation, it might take an hour and a half. If it's a very easy plot where you're just dropping, you're doing your point intercept, your presence absence survey of grass, leaf, grass, litter, though it might take you half an hour.
Okay, so the scan itself is amazingly fast.
Yes.
It's the vegetation and the fuels and the litter and duff layer measurements that still continue to take time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see this as eventually leading to a point where we have enough um, research about how to use this TLS data that we won't have to do the additional vegetation measurements and we'll just be able to scan plots? Is that where this is going?
It depends on the habitat type. We are still exploring the different habitats, but for like the southern pine forest, we are just kind of the scan and go phase of that. Every year at the refuges that we have the first year data for, we do try to do a quality control about 5 plots, just to make sure that the models are still reporting good outcomes and
Mhm.
alignments, those linear models looking at the observed value versus the predicted value. But yes, for the habitats that we have a lot of training data for, those models will be very well refined.
Excellent. We have some questions that are coming in. Alex asks, is Intellimon able to process sorry about, I don't know, .fls scans yet?
So the file type that we input is PTX, and it's not, I do not believe that we have models for Faro yet. No.
And a good question here from Carrie. Carrie says, are the hardware and software costs high? Would this technology be within the reach for a small nonprofit?
The laser packages are about $30,000, but once you have the equipment, right now there's not, you can just update the firmware. You do also have to purchase a license. I'm not sure what the current cost is for the license, and that license is for the software for converting the scans, and putting them into that point cloud phase, um, point cloud, file. And but you can get like a lifetime license, or you could get a 2-year or 4-year.
Great. So questions that you mentioned software to process the data from the TLS. Is that something that refuges are able to do themselves, or you mentioned Kisatchie, so national forest sites. So, or is that something that has to be sent somewhere else to be computed?
Just converting the file type can be done on your computer, and that's for the TLS.
Mhm.
The airborne LiDAR, that has to be processed through the supercomputer that NMC has. So we have to send that to them for the process to be completed. But for the TLS scans, they can be converted on your system and then uploaded to Intellimon, and within 24 to 48 hours, those scans will appear on Intellimon for you to download the data from. And whenever you look on Intellimon, you do get a tree count, mean canopy base height, among other metrics, just from looking at Intellimon. And then you can input your email, and then you will be sent a link to access the more detailed metrics from. And there's a file within that folder that you download that explains what each of those metrics means, a metadata file.
Mhm. Here's a question in the Q&A from Matthew. Matthew says, what are the database requirements for point cloud data? Is very large storage capacity required? And will Intellimon handle very large expansions?
Right now, the servers are adequately suitable for handling those. It depends on how many scans you are collecting. I'm trying to remember it kind of ranges depending on the density of the scans. But you do need some storage capabilities, but you can just get a couple terabyte hard drive and that has definitely the capacity to hold your scans, especially just for singular refuge.
Mhm. Is this something that you've seen, or are you aware of any folks outside of U.S. Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Forest Service using this equipment
Yeah,
or
so a
techniques?
Department of Defense there's some researchers with national parks using the equipment,
Mhm.
and this equipment is used in a wide realm of applications from, documenting crime scenes to LiDARs used in your vehicles. But for this specific use in Telemon, if you go on the Telemon, you can see all the different partners that use that in Telemon database, and then there are a couple private as well. So Department of Defense has some their own private accounts, and then also the Bureau of Indian Affairs has their own private account.
So what does the future of this look like to you? Where do you see this going, especially here in the Southeast?
I think just really having land managers use it for their prioritization, understanding how just really showing and justifying our land management practices
Mhm.
based upon this data, and just really help inform, empowering them to make decisions for their land management based upon the data.
So one of your kind of wrap up slides, you mentioned fuels and the need for future research. So what kinds of things do you think this might allow us to quantify in the landscape if we had additional research to explore the relationships between the point clouds and other things that we can measure on the ground?
I I don't even know if we have that answer yet, because we
Yeah.
can just measure this new component that we were not previously able to measure. It is just a whole new dimension that has been opened up, and there's just so much potential for the application of this
Mhm.
that it may be we can't even think about it currently and predict that currently, because it's just this whole new dimension that we were not able to capture before.
That's cool. So one of the things that you were saying was, as new relationships are understood and quantified between things that we're able to measure on the ground and things that the point clouds can resolve, because you have this archive of point cloud data going back in time, the idea is we'll be able to take those new relationships, apply them to that archive of data, and then have basically new understandings and new metrics from scans that could have been made years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think the really next big leap would be that species identification.
Uh-huh.
Everyone asks a lot for invasive species, identifying invasive species. That way you can really mitigate the spread as it's occurring. Um, so I think that's going to be the next big leap that we are able to tackle.
That would be cool. All right. Well, it looks like we've pretty much run up to the end of our questions and our time here today. So, Emily, thank you so much for your presentation. Do you have any final comments, remarks that you'd like to share with us?
I've already said there's just so much potential for this tool, but with all the innovation, there are going to be growing pains and different challenges. But if we don't start investing the resources into refining the process, then we cannot even explore all the possible applications.